We've had an overwhelming response from institutions and organisations across Australia. Thank you for your support. It's my great pleasure and honour to warmly welcome to this conference more than 2,500 attendees. Hello from 60 organisations and 50 universities. Welcome to you all. We look forward to hearing from you in discussions and lodging your questions for our speakers in each session. Please get involved, engaged and participate because it's you who will make this conference a success. TEMC 2021 online is being broadcast through a dedicated virtual platform powered by On Air. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look around. You can explore the meeting hub, check out the exhibitor hall and investigate the on-demand gallery throughout the course of the event. If you haven't, your settings and add your photo file so new connections can know more about you. Speaking of which, a little about me. I've been a TV journalist and news anchor for more than 20 years, and I'm a newly minted HarperCollins author this year. I love live broadcasts, and I feel really so lucky to be able to stay connected and be supporting this event using the magic of modern technology. It really is amazing. You can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram or right here for the next 3 days. Now, in terms of finding out more about others who are here, the Meeting Hub survey on your portal has a filter to determine which attendees will optimise your experience. Your AirTouch device at the bottom right of your screen is like your personal device designed to enhance your experience in all areas of the portal. Any trouble with the platform, we'll just click on the red headset to get in touch with our support technicians. They are whizzes. Now, so on behalf of the joys of TEMC, who are the association TEFMA, to thank the local author for 2 years. And thank you for showing agility in the face of significant obstacles to bring this event to life. First, when you began for the 2020 conference and then again for 2021. This team will attest, I'm sure, that it's been a long haul to get here, but will also assure you that the next 3 days are going to be so full of wonderful presentations that every put in has been worth it. So please embrace every opportunity to connect and reconnect virtually. And most of all today, please have fun. The main theme of TEM Conference is bright futures, and we are all hopeful that bright futures are exactly what we all have to look forward to. Now, about the program ahead. We have an exciting and engaging lineup in store for you. 4 hours of content each day will take you through topics on rising to greater heights, planet inclusion and respect, the post-2020 campus, the post-2020 student, and post-2020 pedagogy. You can visit the on-demand gallery and watch the videos and content during the breaks, and you can even leave questions for the presenter to answer later. I'll be here with you over the next 3 days to introduce the great lineup of speakers and to give you some reminders to help you enjoy the online conference even more. We're very close to kicking off, but before we do, I'd like to pay thanks to our event sponsors. Major sponsor, Turner & Townsend, thank you for backing this event. On Wednesday, the 13th of October, Turner & Townsend will be giving a presentation, The Journey to Net Zero. Please watch, it promises to be enlightening. I would also like to thank ARM Architecture, Atura, Grosvenor Engineering Group, MGS Architects, Warren and Mahoney, Burke and Bootloop Architects, Tribal, KeyClean, Asset Works, Ambius, Capital Insight, GJK Facility Services, Integrated Facility Management, Plan On, and Smarter City Solutions. Thank you all. Don't forget to engage with our exhibitors at their virtual exhibition booth, because without them, we couldn't be here for you. Remember, you can connect with your colleagues on this platform, and don't forget to watch the 4 mini movement videos that have been added to the program to encourage you to stretch in between sessions. Yes, stretch. It's good for us. And once you've got the blood flowing, it wouldn't be a conference without a little competition. There are points up for grabs throughout the event. All you have to do is get involved. You can click your points tally to see a list of ways to increase your points. Thank you to our sponsors and exhibitors for contributing these fabulous prizes. Here is what you can win. A Fitbit Versa 2 Smart Fitness Watch, thanks to Grosvenor. Verve and a box of chocolates. Very nice. Thank you, GJK. A local wine hamper courtesy of Capital Insight. 6 $100 vouchers from ATEM and TEFMA. Plan On Software has donated a beautiful field guide to The Birds of Australia by Simpson and Day. Thank you very much for that. And Ambius gives us a desktop container and plant, plus an obligation-free plantscape consultation. Thank you. Excellent prizes. So if you really want to win and you love a challenge, there are some trivia questions within the goals to help you boost your points. And I'll give you a tip: visit the exhibitors and you may just find some of the answers. Get posting in the event stream, share your experiences and thoughts, engage with your fellow delegates. There are so many ways to increase your chances in the prize draw. So now I have your full attention with those prizes. The last thing to remember is that each session has a discussion forum and a live Q&A box. So please don't be shy, engage with the speakers and the topics, and you will make this event hum. Without further ado, it is time to begin with our first speaker to commence proceeding in welcoming Mr. Glenn Mowbray, President of the Tertiary Education Facilities Management Association. Welcome, Glenn.
Hello and welcome to the 2021 Tertiary Education Management Conference, which, as you have heard, is being held online for the first time in our 20-year conference history. As the current President of TEFMA, I'm humbled to have the honour of opening this event. Despite the disruption that the sector has faced over the past 18 months, both TEFMA and ATEM continue to focus on providing services, events and professional development opportunities that are relevant to our members and the tertiary education sector. Delivering TEMC is part of this commitment to connect with what is happening in the sector as we explore this year's theme, Bright Futures. The 2021 online conference focuses on contemporary topics including post-COVID campuses, strategies and pedagogy, stronger emphasis on student experience, the recognition of Indigenous people within education, sustainability and the growing prominence of the risks of climate change. TEMC will showcase how together, our members, that's all of you, can lead the bright futures ahead of us and will continue to drive our institutions as leading international powerhouses within a dynamic and vibrant global tertiary sector. Attendance at this year's event has seen some phenomenal results already, with over 2,500 delegates from higher education institutions across the globe, including Australia, New Zealand, Dubai, India, Malaysia, Guinea, South Africa, Spain, the United Kingdom and Vietnam. I thank you all for joining us despite some crazy time zone differences, and I know that you will benefit from the content shared and connections made throughout the week. Many people have contributed to the success that this year's TEMC will enjoy. It's not been without its challenges, and the local organising committee initially came together in 2019 planning for a 2020 event in Brisbane. Unfortunately, the pandemic saw the conference postponed to this year and then completely turned on its head to bring it online. The TEFMA and ATEM boards sought then to make the learning opportunities more accessible for as many members as possible. Whilst the experience will be different this year, please do use the on-air conference platform to stream live sessions, review the on-demand content, engage with the sponsors and exhibitors that have made this event possible, and to to expand your networks and make meaningful connections that will help you in your everyday. Events such as TEMC are simply not possible partners. Turner & Townsend are the major sponsors for this year's event, and I'd like to personally thank Robin Sweezy and the Turner & Townsend team for their support. The TNT video on the conference foyer homepage highlights the many diverse and stellar projects that they have delivered for and with our institutional members, demonstrating the ongoing success Turner & Townsend bring to our higher education sector. I ask all of you to please also take the time to connect with all of our other sponsors and exhibitors throughout the virtual platform during the event, which will undoubtedly connect you with new ideas to help you build bright futures at your home institutions. I want to thank up front the enormous efforts of our volunteer local organising committee for their long and outstanding contributions that have all together this week. I give particular thanks to the conference chair, Jeff Dennis, together with Lee Burgess, Hilary Kavanagh, Tim Sweeney, Kathy Carey, Louise Batchelor, Nancy Lee, Anita Wielden, Margaret Ridley, and Elizabeth Moon. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Conference Steering Committee for their guidance to help navigate the many challenges required to host this event. Catherine Blythe, Mark Hatwell, Fiona Bygraves, Gary Bradley, Dominic Marafiotti, and John Peacock. Finally, a special shout out is also noted for Paula Leishman and her team at Leishman Associates, who have brought significant energy and experience to bring the ideas of the LOC and steering committees to life. Thank you again to all of our volunteers, speakers, sponsors, exhibitors, and partners for coming together to make this Tertiary Education Management Conference happen. Thank you to you, the delegates, for making the time to engage, share, and learn. And thank you to your institutions for allowing us all to invest our time to strengthen and build ourselves and our sector. I would encourage everyone networking this week to use the meeting hub within the conference platform to find, connect, and engage with this collective team of champions to also pass on your thanks. And on that note, I wish you all a fantastic week. I look forward to meeting new people, engaging and learning from and with others. I trust that you will all enjoy your experience and the bright futures that this conference will undoubtedly help to shape. Thank you and have a great conference.
Thank you, Glenn. And I know that you're coming to us from challenging times in lockdown in Canberra as well. Thank you so much. And despite all of the challenges that we're all facing in all shapes and sizes, we are going to have a great conference. That's a promise. Next, we have our first keynote speaker. Thanks to Warren and Mahoney for sponsoring this session. You're about to hear about managing higher education in the era of climate change. Our speaker is one of Australia's leading thinkers and writers on sustainability and the environment, a scientist, explorer, and conservationist with over 20 expeditions to remote regions and 30 books under his belt. He was described by Sir David Attenborough, no less, as one of the great explorers, a scientist who's discovered more new species than Charles Darwin. His landmark works, The Future Eaters and The Weathermakers, have changed the way we think about the environmental challenges facing the world. Australian of the Year in 2007, working closely with governments and businesses globally on climate change action, in 2011 he became Australia's Chief Climate Commissioner, and in 2013 he founded and heads the Australian Climate Council. In May this year, our speaker was awarded the prestigious Geddes Environment Medal by the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure and honour to introduce the man behind this exemplary resume, Professor Tim Flannery. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Mimi. I'm calling into the conference from the banks of the Hawkesbury River in Darug country in the Sydney area, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. We're experiencing our first day post-lockdown after 106 days of lockdown. So for those of you who are in other parts of the world which are still locked down, I'd just like to say lockdown does end. There are great things on our horizon, and I think that your theme for this conference of a brighter future is a very, very appropriate one. When I look at the job that you've done in terms of managing higher education through this last 18-month period, I can't imagine a more challenging or difficult job or a more multi-dimensional job. So all credit to you. I know the conference online might be something new for you all, but let's make it as much fun and as interesting as we can. And hopefully in future, we'll be able to meet face to face. Look, what I really want to talk about today is the climate challenge that we can see building. We know we're only a few weeks out from Glasgow now, from this incredibly important climate meeting. We can see what an all-embracing issue it is for us. And while it's true that we need to change our industry, we'll need to change our electricity sector and generation and so forth, there'll also be big impacts on tertiary education. And I think it's my responsibility today to sort of try to lead you through what to expect. In other words, how big is this challenge going to be? How fast is it coming at us? So that we can be best prepared to win we'd all like to see. What we've experienced in COVID over the last 18 months is in some ways not dissimilar to the sort of challenge that climate change presents us. And as I give my presentation, you'll see where those similarities lie. I guess the big difference is climate change is it's slower moving, relatively. We work on decade-long timelines. But when you're planning big infrastructure change, of course, a decade slips by very, very quickly. It's hardly adequate in terms of the kind of preparations we need. So the sort of the war footing we've had really with COVID, where we've taken difficult actions very promptly here in Australia, they're the sort of things we need to see when it comes to climate change as well. So a good starting point really for understanding where we are in terms of the climate challenge is the Intergovernmental Panel's 6th assessment report on the state of Earth's climate. That report was released just a couple of months ago. The IPCC includes really the best climate scientists on the planet, as well as government representatives and industry and community representatives. It's a big organisation. It takes a long time to get its reports together. They report roughly every 6 to 8 years. And that report that they present is enormous. It includes all of the latest climate science and gives us a kind of a summary, really, of where we stand. So if you look at that 6th assessment report that was produced so recently, it says that we can still enjoy that brighter future, but that there is a very narrow window of opportunity within which to act before that opportunity may be closed on us. So this really is the critical time for us all now. The next few years and the next decade are critical in terms of our climate response. They will determine Earth's climate many centuries from now. The other point that the scientists are making is that the sort of changes that we are now creating in Earth's climate system as a result of our enormous greenhouse gas emissions are unprecedented in the geological history of our planet. They're larger and faster than other changes. The nearest that scientists have been able to find is the great extinction event that occurred 66 million years ago that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and an incredible change on our planet. And of course, that was delivered by an asteroid strike on our Earth, not on a stream of pollution. So things won't be the same as they were 66 million years ago, but in terms of scale and speed, those are the sort of changes that we are looking at. Just to give you a sense of the trajectory of change, I'd like to reflect back on the last 15 or so years. I was made Australian of the Year back in 2007 for really raising the flag about the need for climate action. Since then, almost a third of all of the greenhouse gas pollution that our species has ever emitted in the history of our planet have been emitted just in the last 15 years. So you can see how the challenge has grown, how quickly it's grown, and how the urgency has grown, and how the scientific warnings have accelerated as we've seen this incredible increase in greenhouse gas pollution. Of course, the greenhouse gases, we have known for 200 years how they work. Back in the 1820s, the initial work was done on how the greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere and act like a blanket on the earth and increase the average warmth. Back in 1905, Svante Arrhenius, one of the early Nobel laureates in chemistry, did the very difficult calculations back then when there was no computers to work out how much of an impact those greenhouse gases had. And of course, in the 1970s, the computer models that were developed reinforced Arrhenius's message. They showed that, that we would face very substantial warming if we doubled the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we, of course, so the original level of greenhouse gases before the Industrial Revolution was on the order of 280 parts per million. We now sit at 212 parts per million of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. The greenhouse gases, it's also important to understand, operate on their own timescale. So the molecule of CO2 that I've put into the atmosphere today through breathing, for example, won't reach its full warming potential, or what's called its full warming potential, that's its capacity to capture heat, for another 20 or so years. So what that means in terms of our overall pollution stream is that we have baked in changes to the climate system for the next 20 years. Now, we've seen how climate impacts have grown over the last decade, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's worth just considering a few of the impacts, and particularly here in southeastern Australia, but they're reflected globally. So, here in southeastern Australia in 2018 and 2019, we had the driest years on record in the region, almost very low flows into the Murray-Darling Basin, which was our breadbasket, an incredible drying of the forest, and of course they were the preconditions that were necessary for the extraordinary fire season we saw here in southeastern Australia over the Black Summer of 2019-2020. In that year, we saw 21% of the temperate broadleaf forests of our country burned. The most severe fire season prior to that event saw only 2% of those forests burned. So as a result of climate change, this extraordinary drying in southeastern Australia and increasing temperatures, we've seen a quantum leap really in terms of the amount of forests burned. We're also seeing more and more severe in Australia is getting longer. The duration of individual heat waves is increasing, and the average temperature experienced during those heat waves is increasing. That's a concern for us because heat waves are the most dangerous of all of the natural phenomena that we see here in Australia. They kill more of us than cyclones, floods, crocodiles, sharks, or anything else. So, they are just two of the many, many areas of climate impact that we'll see. And you can see that we're starting to experience an acceleration, that we're at the beginning of larger changes, and we must be prepared for those changes. The thing that scientists are most concerned about really is that as we increase the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we will trigger what are called Earth's tipping points. So these are destabilizations of systems that keep Earth's climate in equilibrium. Scientists have recognized over a dozen of Earth's tipping points. We won't discuss them all today, but it's worth having a look at just a few. So one concerns the Arctic ice. If you follow what's happening to the Arctic ice every year, well, I'll give you some good news first. You'll understand this year's been pretty good for the Antarctic ice. It's been only the 12th lowest extent of Arctic ice on record, but the general trajectory is very clear that we're losing Arctic ice over summer. And what that means is that, normally if you've got an ice-covered pole, it acts as almost like a refrigerator for the whole planet because sunlight striking that very bright ice bounces back into space without leaving energy at the surface of the planet. But if you replace that very bright surface with a darker surface, say the open ocean, 90% of that energy is absorbed into the ocean and turned into heat energy. So the water's warm, and therefore it's like a self-reinforcing loop. The more the water's warm, the less ice there is, until finally there is no Arctic ice at all. And if we get to that point, we will have triggered one of Earth's tipping points, where we're going from a system that keeps Earth cool to a system that heats our planet. The Greenland ice cap, of course, is adjacent to the Arctic ice cap, and it represents another tipping point. You know, the Greenland ice, it's an enormous area of ice. It really is a sort of a living fossil. Under current climatic circumstances, it would never form. So as we melt that ice, we can trigger an ongoing melting where we'll never see the ice recover. Were that to happen, we would raise global sea levels by something like 6 to 7 metres, and that would be an irreversible process. It is concerning to scientists and others to see phenomena such as the first rainfall ever recorded across the highest part of the Greenland ice cap just this year. So, and that rain, of course, it melts the ice. It's not like snowfall. It insulates the ice and allows it to build up. The rain melts it. So as the planet warms, we face another tipping point there. The permafrost across the high Arctic is another potential tipping point. As it melts, it releases enormous amounts of methane and carbon, CO2, that get into the atmosphere and continue the warming. Other tipping points exist at lower latitude. One particularly important one is the Amazon rainforest. For most of human history, the Amazon rainforest has been a carbon sink. It absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere as the plants grow, and it sequesters the CO2 in living biomass and in soils. Just over the last few years, we've seen the eastern Amazon rainforest change from a sink to a source. And the reason for that is changing climatic conditions have caused drying, which causes fires. That, combined with human clearing of rainforests, has tipped the balance, and we're now seeing the eastern Amazon exhale CO2 rather than absorb it. Just one final tipping point that scientists are watching very closely is the ocean circulation. We've seen signs of a slowing circulation. If that happens, then the Earth system, if that continues rather, to where we see a fundamental reorganisation of ocean circulation, that will have a profound impact on our planet. Scientists think maybe we can afford to trigger one or two of those tipping points with that. We will set ourselves on an irreversible trajectory of warming, and we don't know where that will end. So that's why the scientists talk about this narrow window of opportunity to act before we trigger those tipping points. And that's why action now, particularly with the Glasgow summit coming up, is just so critically important. We've already had one very important global meeting in terms of climate change, and that was in Paris in 2015, where the nations of the world signed the Paris Agreement. And that was a fantastic agreement. It showed there was a political will to act. And that agreement basically said that we should try to stabilise Earth's temperature at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, but certainly at no more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average. Sadly, the individual pledges that nations brought to that meeting were such that even at the meeting's end, we were still headed for a warming of about 3.4 degrees before the end of the century, so far above the agreement's aspirations. Things have been tightened up since then. Nations have pledged more and more reductions, but we're still heading for about 2.7 degrees of warming. So that's why the pledges in Glasgow are so critical. They must bring us in line with that 1.5 to 2 degree window. Otherwise, we will trigger, most likely, too many tipping points, and we'll see a runaway warming. After that, it won't matter what we do. We will face a very hostile future. Unfortunately, the best recent science is suggesting to us that it's no longer possible to stabilise at 1.5 degrees of warming. There's just too much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So instead, what scientists are saying is that we look like the best case scenario at 1.7 to 1.8 degrees above, and then use technologies which are called drawdown to take CO2 out of the atmosphere to come back down to 1.5 degrees. But that will require a very prompt action, and I'll come back a bit later to the drawdown aspects of that, but it will require absolutely prompt action now to cut emissions as hard and fast as is humanly possible in order to keep that window open. So what needs to happen? We need a very much more comprehensive approach to the climate problem than we've seen before. And that approach needs to cover 3 areas, really. The first is to cut emissions hard and fast, efficiently resilient in terms of our adaptation to upper capacity to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere for the reasons that I've just outlined. So the scale of all of those challenges is very large. In order to stay or to stabilise temperatures at 1.7 to 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average, we really need to decarbonise our economies, in other words, reach net zero by about 2035. Now, you've heard probably people talking about net zero by 2050, and that is still the politically conventional way of seeing it. But the reality is that we will need to do that about 15 years earlier than we thought, simply because of the vast volumes of greenhouse gases that have been pumped into the atmosphere and continue to be pumped into the atmosphere. Now, that is a huge challenge. Let's make no mistake about that. It will require an emergency and industry to do much of that. There are 3 sectors really responsible for most of our emissions. Think about particularly fossil fuels. We've got the electricity generation sector, we've got transport, and we've got industrial processes. So if you look across the board at where we might go for getting those emissions down very fast, the easiest sector by far is electricity. There's only a few dozen major fossil fuel electricity generators in Australia, and the world is the same. These are big pieces of kit, and they can be replaced. Here in Australia, the various studies have been done to show that with appropriate action, within 5 years, we could effectively decarbonise our grid here in Australia. And the good news is that renewable energy is now the cheapest across most of the world. So we're facing a win-win situation where we can make the investments to replace the old polluting generation, maybe a bit in advance of its use-by date, but we can do it with clean, cheap energy. And we'll need to invest, of course, in transmission and storage and all the rest of it, but that is all doable. People can see a way through for that. So if we can manage to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030, we will have a big win. About 1/3 of our emissions will be taken out of the equation, and that is extremely important. In fact, state governments are planning for just such an eventuality. So the New South Wales government has legislated a program of changes that will see the coal-fired generators out of the electricity mix in that state, almost entirely by 2030. If they see a different problem with a longer lead time, there are millions of fossil-fuelled motor vehicles, millions worldwide. Here in Australia, they have a life of there's a long time to replacement. And if we want to electrify transport and be running our electricity grid from clean sources, we'll need to increase our clean electricity generation, but make sure that we have all of the charging points that are going to be required to run a clean, green transport sector. That again is doable. We think, looking at Europe and others, where some of the major auto manufacturers have pledged to cease making fossil-fuelled vehicles as early as 2025 or 2030, that we can make that transition substantially within the time available. But what's required is the infrastructure. We'll need to make sure that charging infrastructure is laid out across the board. And, you know, I've been in the university sector on and off for most of my life. I've seen the fights that go on around parking, and you'll be much more familiar with that than I am, and rights to parking. But there's a new challenge here now, which is to make sure that we have the capacity to charge electric vehicles across campuses. And you know, not just for cars. This is going to be for trucks, buses, other forms of transport that are required to get us through to that clean future. The third area, the industrial processes, is one where higher education can play a vitally important role. You know, for the large industrial processes such as steel making, cement making, glass making, all of those sort of things, we don't yet have fully realised responses. You know, if you look at steel making, for example, you know, a Swedish steel maker just in the last few months made their first batch of pure green steel made using hydrogen. So we're a long way from having fully commercialised solutions to many of those areas. And there is still a very, very important role in terms of research in those areas, in developing those technologies. We know we're going to have to lay them out extremely quickly between now and 2035. But again, that is doable with the right sort of policy response by government. And certainly there is an industry appetite for this and an investment appetite to make sure that these changes can happen very quickly. So the door is open for us. We simply need to act with the alacrity required to avoid those climate tipping points. So, you know, if I look at this from a tertiary education management perspective, you know, just that first section I was talking about, I see a massive challenge. It's going to be an infrastructure challenge. It's going to be a pedagogical challenge. It's going to be a research challenge. It goes across the board. How do we create the green campus of the future? The students are one across the board that'll help us deal with this great transition that we're facing. These are huge challenges. The challenges only grow, though, when we consider that issue that I talked about of having baked in really 20 years of climate change. So between now and 2040, we're not going to see things get any better in terms of climate impacts. So what that means is the emergency room, in effect, that we need to create to deal with those consequences is going to be very, very broad indeed. If we start just with our biodiversity, it will include innovating to protect our Great Barrier Reef. It is one of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet in terms of climate change, and we need to think very carefully about how we will innovate to make sure that the reef has the best chance of survival. Looking at our endangered species across Australia, what are the cost-effective actions that we can take to give them the best chance of survival? And if we come to humanity, and I put them second simply, we'll have to have infrastructure which is capable of dealing with the new climate impacts. Let's just start with heat waves, because we mentioned that early on. How are we going to make sure that our infrastructure is such that those heat wave impacts can be minimised? Are our campuses well insulated enough to allow that? Do our hospitals have sufficient capacity to make sure that from these heat waves are given the best chance of survival? These are real challenges that we need to start thinking about now. Coming to bushfires, you know, do we have the infrastructure we require to make sure we can deal with the bushfires of the 21st century, which are an order of magnitude larger? And the smoke impacts, by the way, are enormous from those bushfires. We lost 33 lives from the Australian bushfires. Of that, 120 people died from smoke inhalation. So again, we need to be prepared. Think about sea level rise and its impact. I don't know whether it's all campuses or infrastructure by the coast, but we know that sea level rise is baked in for the next few decades. We'll see increasing impacts of sea level rise, and we'll have to make what assets we protect and which we abandon, simply because the scale of the change is going to be so enormous. So we need to start thinking and planning for that. We also thinking very carefully about this broader impacts. So think about air travel, for example, and the importance of air travel to your sector. Are in the air sector hard enough and fast enough to satisfy students who are increasingly green in their outlook, who may not want to, who might find it immoral to get on an aeroplane and fly to another continent? So in terms of adapting, we're really barely beginning, I think, to do that in a meaningful way at the moment. But it must become the focus of a degree than it is now, and the focus of industry and the focus of education. I'll finally turn to that issue that I mentioned. We now know we're in a position where we'll need to get CO2 out of the air at scale. And this is really a very fledgling area, probably the lowest hanging fruit for this are the sort of things that Sir David Attenborough talked about in his witness statement, where he said that if humanity is to help our Earth, we have to regrow our forests. We have to look after our, in terms of carbon transportation. And of course, healthy oceans have the Earth climate system since time began. The oceans are 500 times larger than the atmosphere. They are the ultimate repository in the system that's drawn out and deposited on the ocean floor. Just to give you one example of how important a healthy ocean is, when we, nearly half a century ago, what that did was cut off one of the great carbon transportation pathways of our planet. At the surface of the ocean, they defecate, and their feces carry the carbon that those krill and zooplankton. And once it's below a kilometre, that carbon stays out of the atmosphere system. So the recovery of the great whale populations of places like Australia also signal a healing of our planet in terms of carbon drawdown. Whales may be responsible for as much as a gigaton of carbon drawdown per year, which is a huge contribution, 1 billion tonnes a year, a huge contribution to the healing of our planet. But we need to do much more. We know we'll need to grow seaweed at scale because seaweed grows fast. It is truly the industry of the future. And seaweed that's washed away from seaweed farms and gets down into the deep ocean below a kilometre represents another extraction. So there is a whole area there that we need to get involved with. We need to understand the oceans better. We need to understand mariculture better. We need to make the most of these opportunities. Finally, we can look at opportunities on land in sustainable farming, incredibly important, to look at carbon sequestration in our soils and how we best utilise our croplands and our grazing lands to sequester carbon. Again, seaweed offers an opportunity. Here in Australia, we are now growing a kind of sea cattle by 98%. And the amount of seaweed the cows need to eat every day is 25 grams, just that much. And that methane emissions is being trialled now at a very large scale, 160 with this. Those sort of opportunities are enormous, and they come out of and they were never expected. No one thought we'd find a seaweed that would have such miraculous properties, but such is the is the results of pure research. I've concentrated very much on the challenges for the Earth of creating this massive and rapid transition. But the opportunities are through your doors. This year and next will be from the huge opportunities, and of course those who've come through benefiting from the enormous opportunities that are opened up by things as we start to use hydrogen to replace carbon as a reductant, as a source of energy, who will be inventing hitherto unthought of solutions to this problem, like the seaweed I mentioned, that can be fed to cattle through. Think of a great human journey here, where we crude means of generating electricity and managing ourselves of human existence, where what we do must strengthen, degrade it. It's a huge challenge, but we know it is possible. Already with clean energy, cheaper than fossil fuel-based energy, we face a win-win. Those technologies, and as we adapt ever faster, the number of win-wins will grow. So I'm not trying to shield you from the fact that we face an enormous challenge and that your sector particularly has a critical role. But what I am saying is that if we deal successfully with the challenge, the future is going to be better than the past. And with that, I will leave you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That and the pun, you just touched the tip of the iceberg there with all of the climate is it all beautifully, and we have some wonderful questions that have come in. The first one that I'll put to you is from Jennifer, and she is thanking you for a wonderful presentation, but she's saying, wondering if we're seeking an anticipated benefit to greenhouse gases based on the impacts being reduced. A lot of the world has COVID impacts are going to have
been an impact from COVID on greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and what actually the impact has been quite small. So, you know, we talk about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're currently increasing those parts per million at about 2 to 3 parts per million per year. Last year, that was reduced by about 1/4 part per million because of COVID. So that's kind of good. It's better than it going up, you know, it's better to go up 1.7 parts than 2 parts. But nevertheless, the greenhouse gases continue to accumulate, and the anticipation is that the COVID impact, we can't look to COVID as a solution. It's had an impact, but a small impact. What we need to do in terms of solution is a transformation of our energy sector.
Another question is, do you think that young people are so savvy and discerning that they really will assess a unit change and how they are addressing it when they select a course on this?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure. What I do know about young people is that they are exquisitely attuned to the old thing of do as I say, not do as I do, right? So if they sense the university's just saying do as I say, they'll be turned off. It's do as I do. So universities have to walk the talk. They have to be the change. They have all of those things, and students will pick up on that. And universities that are seen to be progressive in this area will be seen as being honest and far more attractive to students, I think, than others. And of course, students aren't silly. They want a good degree. They want a degree that's got enormous opportunity that is arising. And those degrees those who are simply...
So lead by example and the respect of the students coming in.
It certainly will. I mean, young people are not silly for, do as I say doesn't cut it.
I know. His response to emissions, and you did talk about electric cars and being able to have the charging points at universities. Where can universities sort of seek the type of funding that is going to be required for such an enormous task and an expensive one?
Yeah, look, this is, again, I can see the sector faces enormous financial challenges at the moment. So those questions are very valid. If I was in that sector, I would go out and look for partners. There are people who are laying out these charging systems. The state government is putting money into it. I would say you're going to have to go out and find partners who will help you with that challenge. But it's going to have to be done soon. It's not the sort of thing that can be delayed. And fortunately, the costs are manageable for this sort of stuff. I've been to, when I was in California several years ago, I saw just the ubiquity now of electric charge stations. We know they can be done. There's some very good Australian technology actually that's been developed in terms of electric charging. So we need to make those costs, even if the payback is incorporated through the payment for parking. We're all used to paying for parking. It's a small of having electric charging during the parking. So I would go out and look for partners.
What else would you like to see tertiary education providers doing to contribute to the war on climate change? I mean, there's the charging stations, there's obviously the investment in the courses and programs that help students discover new ways of doing things that don't impact the environment like they have to date. But what other practical things can universities do?
Well, look, the university sector is one of the most complicated sectors in the whole world. I look at vice chancellors in amazement. They're sort of and sometimes I do wonder if they're the kind of monkey riding the elephant. They look like they're guiding the elephant, but are they really guiding the elephant? We don't know. We can't say. Very challenging and difficult. And again, I've worked in universities with people in the management sector, and I think all too often I've seen the management people take a more subservient role than is necessary. I mean, you guys know about the tech, about the nitty-gritty of running tertiary education. You know what can be done. And I think when it comes to, engagement in your sector, I wouldn't like to tell you, what I can say is be proactive. In the discussions that are happening, no one is better positioned than you to understand what can be done and what can be done cost effectively, what can be done now, what might need to wait for some changes.
So on that note, I'll just, one delegate, Mark, says, on that topic, what type of carbon to become carbon neutral? Because that's
the contribution. It's a difficult question to answer. So because we're atmosphere and cut emissions, about offsets doesn't really work, if you get my meaning. So we can't just say, oh, well, we'll offset for it. That world is past now. That opportunity passed when it became impossible to get to 1.5 degrees just by cutting.
Okay.
But university amounts of land, and one thing that can be done, regarded as an offset, I'd more regard it as a contribution to draw down a zero with your emissions, but also contribute to drawdown through with cooling, reflect sunlight back to space. So by having by changing what's called the albedo of your campus, you can do a lot. So instead of dark roofs and dark surfaces, look campus, along with trees.
Planting trees, things on campus?
Look, I'm not really an expert in buildings on campus and know how uncomfortable they can be and how expensive they are to retrofit and all the rest of it.
Okay, I'm going to take you to a vehicle question then, a question from Matt. Tim, how far away do you think we are from replacing diesel trucks with electric trucks? Because obviously trucking transportation is a huge issue, far beyond our domestic vehicles. Yeah.
Look, for some trucks, it's already cost effective to do it. So garbage collection vehicles, for example, that run a set route, they're increasingly being deployed because they're already cost effective. There's an upfront cost, but you save a huge amount in terms of diesel, and of course they're quieter and better. And councils increasingly setting up solar parks out near there, those trucks to be charged. So that sort of vehicles, it's already happening. Long distance haulage is a different matter. So we'll have to wait to see how that works out. But certainly either hydrogen or batteries is going to be the future for all transport. It simply has to be.
A question here from Sophie, who says, huge challenges for us all. I wonder how the carbon footprint of our virtual activities compares to the carbon footprint of flying. Well, we're undertaking a virtual activity right now. What are your thoughts on the virtual versus the in-person?
Oh, look, I think the virtual's got to be a lot more carbon effective. Of course, there's a downside to it. We don't get to meet each other and interact the way we do. I think there's still going to be room for both. Are there, which is frustrating. We know that e-fuels, which are made from atmospheric carbon dioxide and hydrogen from electrolysis, they're already being made in small batches. They're more expensive, and we need to scale up. But we know because those technologies are already there. So the faster that's accelerated, the sooner we'll be back to a face-to-face world.
So we can have our cake and
eventually, once we develop these new technologies, clean steel and so forth, those building problems as well. If we had clean steel and carbon neutral concrete and electric vehicles, the transition is self-reinforcing.
So a question from me, I'm very interested in what you're saying about David Attenborough at the one end of the generational scale, and I wonder what you think about what Greta Thunberg is saying about the blah, blah, blah and the no action of the governments of the world. Where do you sit between the two approaches?
Look, I understand Greta's impatience. She's a young person. Her whole future is going to hang on this. And of course, she's impatient. We are making some progress. It's woefully inadequate, but we are making some progress. I think we'd all feel better if there was a universal recognition of the scale and speed of the change required, and government was then able to act on that. We're still negotiating that. Glasgow, I think, will go some way towards getting us a faster response. So, yes, Greta's right, but I also empathise with those who are actually having to do the change, make the change. It's not easy. We can't ever underestimate the difficulty of that challenge, but it must be done.
So we need the loud voices and the vocalisation of the different generations, especially the younger generation, but we also need the people to practically implement these changes and make these moves forward for the progress of the whole. I guess the aim is, and actually this brings me to another question that we had earlier, which I thought that I'd save towards the end with you, Professor. And that question is, if you were presenting to this conference in 2 years from now, what is it that you would love to be reporting back to these delegates?
Wow, well, I'd love to be reporting back that we had a highly successful meeting in Glasgow, that Australia and the other nations of the world were now on track to try to achieve that 1.7 to 1.8 degrees, that our government had set up a new Department of Climate Impacts or whatever adaptation to manage all of that stuff, that we had a renewed focus on drawdown and that there was a lot of R&D happening in that space and that the universities were carrying that forward with great success. That would please me enormously. But,
that sounds wonderful. It's, you know, anything's possible, and we hope that that will transpire. There's a question here from Kim who says, is there a singular personal recommendation you think we can advise our students to begin to locally affect climate change? So what is that message that institutions can be purveying to their students?
Look, I think it's get involved, get active. You know, all of us are busy. You with 4 children, Mimi, I'm sure busier than most. But you know, we've got to make time to be good citizens, and that means getting involved in a democratic process. You know, I've become a bit involved with the Me Too, Voices Of group, who are looking at how do we get the right sort of representatives in Parliament. You know, so I think just calling your local representative and saying, you know, what are you doing about this great challenge? How are you going to act in Parliament to start making this change? That's powerful. You know, of course, when you vote, also powerful. But you can do even more. If the answer from your local representative is unsatisfactory, you can say, well, we have to go and find a new representative, someone else who is going to do a better job. So, you know, there's lots that can be done. But we have to become engaged more holistically. And I think, you know, the really enduring changes, Mimi, are all bottom up. They're things where people realise that we need to change and then start agitating for it.
So, Professor Tim Flannery, would your parting message to us be something along the lines of, we can all be agents for change? What would you like to say?
That's absolutely right. We can all be the change we want to see in many ways. And leadership might be in your family, it might be in your workplace, it might be in your sports group, it might be in your political life. But we need leadership wherever it is for all of us to become leaders if we're going to do this successfully.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure and an honour to chat with you. So on behalf of all of the delegates here today, thank you so much. All the very best.
It's been a great pleasure, and thank you for your great emceeing.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Well, that was an incredible session. I hope that you enjoyed both our opening sessions as much as I did. That concludes our first plenary session, and in a few moments it's time to join one of the 3 concurrent sessions that will be broadcast. Check your timeline for the start time of each session, as this will be different for all the time zones, particularly if you've set up the time zone in your settings to your local time. If you're on Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time, the next session begins at 12:10. Based on the main themes of the conference, the next presentations will focus on planet inclusion and respect, rising to greater heights, and the post-2020 campus. I'm sure you'll find some great content from these presenters. As you are enjoying the presentations, remember to ask questions. Thank you so much for your questions just now in Tim Flannery's presentation. Ask questions through the online chat system. Tell us how you're enjoying the presentations by completing a survey as you exit the session. If you're facing technical difficulties, please click on the red headset. Our team is here to assist you. Now, please enjoy the concurrent sessions. I'll see you soon.